back, everyone. I'm back from the. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, thank you to Bridget for setting up the afternoon. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the 2026 Hirst Lecture, which will be given by Professor June Barrow-Green, who was awarded the Hirst Prize and Lectureship in 2025 in recognition of her outstanding research and leadership in the history of mathematics. So I'll read the citation for the prize. June Barrow-Green is one of the UK's most accomplished and versatile historians of mathematics. Focusing primarily on the mathematics of the 19th and 20th centuries, her work covers a host of diverse areas, from the history of dynamical systems to Victorian mathematics textbooks. Her impeccably researched monograph, Poincaré and the Three-Body Problem, helped to revive the forgotten story of Poincaré's early contributions to celestial mechanics, involving a detailed study of his prize-winning but flawed 1889 paper on the Three-Body Problem, along with an analysis of the history of the problem, the errors in Poincaré's work, his attempts to deal with them in subsequent publications, and their effect on later developments, most notably the creation of chaos theory in the 20th century. Professor Barrow-Green's research has also encompassed further topics in the history of applied mathematics, various aspects of mathematics at the University of Cambridge, and the history of mathematical models. She has also done much work to draw attention to the contributions of female mathematicians to the subject. In addition to her numerous research publications, Professor Barrow-Green is a gifted expositor and an accomplished lecturer, having given countless invited talks over the last 3 decades, both at home and internationally. She's also served in a variety of leadership roles, including as chair of the Executive Committee of the International Commission on the History of Mathematics, which have further cemented her reputation worldwide as one of the senior figures in the discipline. May I please ask you to join me in welcoming June Barrow-Green.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to live up to it or live up to Bridget's wonderful talk. So thank you very much, Bridget, for that. But I'd also like to begin by sort of thanking really the history of maths community as a whole for supporting me in my career, and really particularly Jeremy Gray, who's here, who was my PhD supervisor, and the book that Chris mentioned would never have happened without Jeremy. I had thought I had finished my PhD. I was big relief, and Jeremy said, no, absolutely not. He said, you know, I always told you you're not writing a PhD thesis, you're writing a book, and you need to do this extra chapter. And I was like, but I'm so glad Jeremy made me do it. So thank you, not only for that, Jeremy, but for so much support and everything over the years. I feel very honoured to have been awarded this prize. I just hope I can do justice to some of the words that Chris has said. And thank you all for coming. Okay, so my topic is Hilda Hudson, a very expert mathematician. Now, I know some of you have heard me talk about her before, but for those of you who haven't, I suspect you may well not have heard of her. And one of the reasons for this talk is I think she deserves to be better known, and I hope as a result of it, she will be. So let me start by talking about her family. So I'm going to talk about her family and her education, and then I'll talk about the areas of maths in which she was involved. So this family tree comes from ancestry.com, and we can see parents up there, 4 children, of whom Hilda is the youngest. But I'm not really convinced that this is Hilda, because this we know is Hilda, but I suspect that this photograph may be a photograph of Ethel when she was younger. So anyway, she comes from a very mathematical family, and a family that was very much connected to Cambridge. Her father had been a 3rd wrangler in the Tripos in 1861, so that meant he was 3rd in the order of merit of the this fiercely difficult maths exam, which doing well in was highly, highly prized. He was also a great supporter for women, women's education in general, but in maths in particular. And he was one of the people who was really helpful in the founding of Newnham College, And in the archives at Newnham, there's lots of correspondence between him because he's really helpful with the accounting and doing various things. And when Newnham starts, he starts giving lectures there, and that's where he meets Hilda's mother, Mary Watson Turnbull. And after a year, she gives up her studies at Newnham. She was a mature student when she was there. She was, as I say, one of the first students. And after a year, she gives up her studies and she marries William Hudson, and has 4 children. Very sadly, she dies actually only a year or so after Hilda was born. But of the 4 children were all mathematically gifted, and particularly the son, Ronald Hudson, was the senior wrangler, and by all accounts was really considered to have huge promise. But tragically, he died in a climbing accident at a young age in 1904. Winifred, equivalent to the 8th wrangler in 1900. Ethel doesn't go to Cambridge, goes to Royal Holloway College, but by the kind of accounts that I've seen, she also was talented in mathematics. Hilda does one better than her sister in the Tripos in 1903, but actually in the following year, when they do part 2, we see actually Winifred did better than Hilda. And it's a bit of a mystery to me as to why actually Winifred doesn't go into mathematics. We do see she does emerge a little bit, but she doesn't go into mathematics in the way that that Hilda does. So let me say just a little bit more about her father. He was, after Hilda's mother dies, he gets a professorship at King's College here in London. He's also has a professorship at the Queen's College, which is the women's college, which is probably more, it's not quite at the same kind of academic standard. One of the things that I found interesting to see was Hardy writes an obituary for William Hudson when he dies. And he says, his daughters are also known as mathematicians of high attainment and original achievement. And so he very clearly says his daughters. So Hardy is aware that there's more than one of them is doing mathematics. By this time, of course, Hilda is well known as a mathematician. So I think so there's kind of some things I need to try and find out a little bit more about. I think about the other 2 girls. So now to talk about Hilda herself, I'm going to kind of following Bridget. I'm just going to call her Hudson from now on. She goes to Newnham. She's coached by Philippa Fawcett. Now, Philippa Fawcett was the person who in 1890 had got marks above the senior wrangler. And that was hugely unexpected that a woman would ever do so well. Of course, at this time, you may have noticed that in the slide where I had the achievements at Cambridge of Hilda and Winifred, that they were equal to or equivalent to the wranglers, because of course at this time women could not get degrees at Cambridge. That only happened in 1948. At this time they could sit the Tripos by right. That had only happened from 1881. In 1880, Charlotte Scott had been given permission to sit the Tripos and had become equivalent to the 8th wrangler, and that was considered beyond almost miraculous. It was sort of in all the newspapers, lots of periodicals. But when Philippa Fawcett goes above the senior wrangler, that even makes the New York Times. I mean, that is how, what a big news it was. So she's coached by Philippa Fawcett, and she's also coached by Arthur Berry, and he is also a former senior wrangler. So these are 2 people who really know how to deal with the Tripos system. Now, Arthur Berry is somebody who we will see cropping up several times as we go along. So after she's done part 2, she spends a semester in Berlin, and from an account that she writes, all she says about it is that she says she attended lectures by Schwarz, Schottky, and Landau, and she makes her career, as we'll see, she makes her career as a geometer. And I think it's quite possible that it was probably Schwarz and Schottky particularly may well have stimulated her interest in algebraic geometry when she was in Berlin. In 1906, she does get a degree because she goes to Trinity College Dublin, which at the time had a reciprocal arrangement with Oxford and Cambridge. And for a few years in the sort of first decade of the 20th century, women who had passed the exams, which would qualify them for degrees, were able to go and get them in Dublin. And they became known as steamboat ladies because they all went over in steamboats. And Philippa Fawcett was also a steamboat lady. Then we see her, she stays on at Newnham. She's appointed as a lecturer and then as a research fellow. She gets a fellowship to go to the States, to go to Bryn Mawr to work with Charlotte Scott. Now, Charlotte Scott, who I just mentioned, so she was a geometer. And so this was a great, this is a really excellent opportunity for Hudson to go there. She must have been supported by her father in these in this traveling. I mean, going to Germany, going to the US. I mean, she got fellowships and so on, but she would have needed A, his permission, and B, I suspect, further financial support. And I probably should have mentioned from the German, when she went to Germany, that wasn't a normal thing that British students tended to do at the time. Grace Chisholm had sort of broken the mold by going to study with Klein in the 1890s. But actually, you know, for her to go to Germany was, yeah, as I say, it was not a particularly usual thing to do. So she goes to Bryn Mawr, and we see Arthur Berry. He says, "I feel sure you have chosen a very good fellow." And he writes to Eleanor Sidgwick, who's the principal of Newnham. So he's you know, involved in this as well. She's the first woman to give a talk at an International Congress of Mathematicians, which she does in 1912 when it's held in Cambridge. She wasn't the first woman to be invited. That was Laura Passati for Rome in 1908, but she had sadly died before the Congress, so she never actually gave her talk. She gets an SCD from Trinity College Dublin for work she's been doing in helping to re-edit one of George Salmon's textbooks. And she makes additions and additional contributions to it. In her obituary at Newnham is this remark: "A practical astronomer in charge of the Newnham Observatory in days of its greatest use and interest." And this was absolute news to me. There's nothing else in her work that has anything to do with astronomy. The only thing that is kind of, there's a survey that goes out to alumni, and when she's really quite elderly, and it says, one of the questions in the thing is, you know, basically, what other things have you been, you know, what other things do you do or have you done? And she just says, a great many interests. And I think actually that sort of sums up, she does seem to have a great many interests, and this is one of them. So then from 1913, she gets a job at the West Ham Technical Institute. Now, this is a college in East London, which is really preparing students for matriculation to the London University. She's selected out of 51 candidates. It makes the news. Here we have an extract from the Daily Mail. Mathematics in the family. Through Daily Mail style, there's an error. It says, "Professor Hudson was third wrangler in 1861, and his brother was a second wrangler." There's absolutely no evidence of a brother, or certainly not one being second wrangler. So she gets the job. She's the only woman in the sort of science department. But what was also, when I found this, it was interesting to see that Leon Isserlis, who was the head of department, he had done the Tripos in the same year as Hudson. So, and he was 18th wrangler. Remember, she was equivalent to 7th wrangler. So he had taken the job as head of department in 1904. He'd done the Tripos, and then he spent a year doing engineering before going to West Ham. But I mean, he surely would have known her. So anyway, so she has the job here at West Ham. He makes quite a good career actually as in statistics after the war. And while she's there, he's doing sort statistics with Pearson at UCL. So I think this would have been quite a good place for her to be in that sense. So just to kind of briefly say what her career is from World War I and afterwards. What I'm going to talk a bit about, I know some of you have heard me talk about this before, in 1916, she does some work with Ronald Ross. 1917 to 1919, she's in the Admiralty Air Department, so she's working on aeronautical engineering. She has a couple of years in industry, and then she stops that, and she basically devotes herself to working on her book, which has been described as her sort of magnus opus. She has a position, a sort of honorary position as the finance secretary of the Student Christian Movement, and her faith is clearly a very important part of her life for her. And then she goes back to do some work with Ross later. So the ones I put in red are just the ones where she's being paid for employment. So notice that she has actually, from West Ham, she has no academic, after that, she has no academic appointment from then. So what about her work? So as I say, she was a geometer, and that is what she's known for. Her obituary in the her LMS obituary by Semple is basically all about her geometry, and her main area of research is Cremona transformations. Arthur Berry pops up again. She in her book credits him with introducing her to the subject. She writes a bunch of articles on the topic. A couple coming out of her visit from Bryn Mawr. Her talk at the ICM is related, and she writes a joint paper with Thomas Wren. And then she also, as I mentioned earlier, she makes some additions and revisions to Salmon's analytic geometry of 3 dimensions, including new chapters on Cremona transformations. And then, of course, her book gets published in 1927. She has 2 other publications in geometry. One is a book, Ruler and Compasses, and you'll see in the exhibition out there, there's a copy of her book and her other books. And do go, by the way, go and see the exhibition afterwards if you haven't seen it already. She writes an article for the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica as well. So to say just a little bit about her work in Cremona transformations. So this quote at the beginning comes from, this is from the beginning of the book, from the preface, and she just says, well, they're powerful tools in many lines of research, and the aim of this book is to bring together all that has so far been published on their construction and use, as regards points and loci in 2 and 3 dimensions. And the most important application is to the resolution of singularities, curves and surfaces, which is treated fully. And this is, it's a heavy tome. I mean, it's 454 pages. It's got a remarkable, or indeed impressive bibliography, as Semple in his obituary wrote. And it was a model of accuracy, as Virgil Snyder, after Thomas American, wrote. But Semple, he doesn't, not everything he says is complimentary. He says her enthusiasm and conscious attention to detail were phenomenal. But her style of exposition, especially in her book, is often off-putting, more especially for the reader who wishes to read what she has to say on a particular topic and finds himself up against a formidable barrage of abstruse abbreviations of her own devising. So I think she's somebody, she's absolutely focused, and I mean, this is a remarkable book, really, because it is so comprehensive for its time. But one of the other things that does come out in from the archives at Newnham is that she wasn't a huge success as a teacher. So I think maybe her way of disseminating knowledge was not she wasn't sort of so focused on her reader as maybe she might have been. Just want to mention her ICM paper, which is related to this. It's about certain types of singularities. But again, here we see Arthur Berry. Pops up again. So in the ICM proceedings, you see all the papers listed, and if anybody's made a substantial contribution to any of the papers, then that's also reported. And he's the one person who's reported as speaking on her papers. I would also just to note that this was the largest ICM to date, and there were 539 men registered for the Congress and 39 women, a number of whom from Cambridge, but actually quite a few came from the US and from Europe. Her book on ruler and compasses is exactly what it sort of says on the tin. It's Euclidean geometry, if you like, because what are the constructions you can do if you've got an unmarked ruler and compasses? So if you've just got a ruler, you can do these linear constructions. You've got the compasses, then you get quadratic constructions. And she shows that you can actually make really incredibly complicated constructions. This diagram I put on here, which is about how to construct two given circles from another circle, and it involves 22 lines that you have to kind of construct. I mean, not an easy thing to do. It was reviewed by Jordan in The Logician in Science Progress. Now, again, I rather doubt this is a journal that has crossed many of your paths, but I point it out because it's 1916. And this is the time when she's working with Ronald Ross. And Ronald Ross was the editor of Science Progress. So I'm sure that that's how that review came about. I also want to point out that it's from this actually rather good Longman's Modern Mathematical Series, which was edited by Francis Sarby Macaulay. Jeremy is the world expert. Very good algebraic geometer who was successful in Cambridge, but then makes his career as a schoolmaster and nurtured a lot of very good mathematicians, including people like Littlewood, people who went on to be senior wranglers. And Jackson was a master at Woolwich, and she credits them very much for helping her with the book. There's this very curious reprint. It was published in 1955. It's published with 3 other books, one of which is Hobson's Squaring the Circle, which is not so surprising. But one of the other ones is Kemp on linkages, and another one is by some lectures by an Indian mathematician on some sort of function. I can't quite remember the title of it now. I mean, it's a very eclectic collection. But again, I mean, it's carefully written. It's very accurate and so forth. But I mean, I'd rather doubt that it would be on many mathematicians' bookshelves today. So now I want to talk, and forgive me for people who heard me talk about this before, so I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, because this is her collaboration with Ronald Ross. These are these 2 papers that she publishes with him that get submitted in 1916. Now, they're actually not really 2 papers. They're really 1 paper. They just follow on consecutively in the proceedings of the Royal Society. And the reason they come in 2 parts is because of the page numbers. The number of pages were limited at the time as to how many pages each article could be, and this was going to be longer than one of them. And Ross had already published part 1, so there was no point. I mean, if they published it as 1 paper, then it would have to have been in the transactions, and that wouldn't have really made any sense. So one really has to think of this as just 1 paper. So let me say a little bit about Ronald Ross, known physician, known for winning the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1902, sort of inaugural one. There's a little bit of debate about that, but the reason was because he was the person who really was able to explain the role of the mosquito as the vector in malaria. And he's in the Indian Medical Service. And then he comes to, when he leaves India at the end of the 19th century, he comes to Liverpool. And that is important for the Hudson story. And he's there, and then of course he comes to London as well. And then he's in the War Office and Ministry of Pensions and so forth. So how does a physician from India basically end up writing a paper with a geometer? So in 1882, Ross in his memoirs describes how he discovered mathematics. He clearly had thrown a few books into his trunk in India, and he sort of pulls this one out, The Orbs of Heaven, and it's about sort of physical astronomy. And he reads about people like Kepler and so forth, and also Newton and people. And these people are saying, he's reading how important mathematics is for astronomy, and it strikes him that the same should be true for medicine. So he devours as much maths as he can, and what that means is actually the textbooks written by Isaac Todhunter, who was the leading textbook writer in Cambridge in the 19th century. So if he was going to grab a bunch of textbooks, that was a pretty good bunch to grab. But we must remember, he never had a formal mathematical training. However, he is convinced that maths is going to be really important in medicine. And in 1904, he gives a talk at the St. Louis International Congress. This is a huge, big congress. He's in the medicine section. There's the math section. Poincaré, for instance, is in the math section. This is high stakes stuff. And as he says, I read the mathematical paper to hundreds of disappointed doctors who did not understand a word I said. And this is a constant refrain from Ross, that he cannot get the doctors to understand. And the problem he has here is he says, well, if you have a bunch of mosquitoes and they're all in this swamp and they come out, where are they going to go? Are they all going to just disappear off into the middle of nowhere, or are they going to do other things? And this turns out it's quite a complicated problem, and is actually the origins of the random walk. And he gets Carl Pearson involved in helping to solve this problem, and so forth. And he then starts bringing mathematics into some of his other work on malaria and so forth. Sorry. And so then he writes this paper, An Application of the Theory of Probabilities to the Study of A Priori Pathometry, Part 1. So that's the Part 1 of the parts we saw earlier. As I say, there's stuff in between here, and I don't have time to talk about. And so what is this paper about? So it's basically, it says, well, you've got a population of individuals. Some of them, they're affected by something, let's say it's a disease, and some of them are unaffected. And then you have things like, you have to think about the birth rate, the death rate, immigration, emigration, and so forth. And you've got, what happens over time. And at some particular point in time, can you work out how many of these people are still going to be alive, basically, in the population, and how many new cases there being, and so on and so forth. He calls his solution the theory of happenings, and he says, well, actually, these ideas could be applied to lots of other things, not just disease. I mean, we could even apply it to commerce, politics, and statesmanship and things. And then he says, well, in the next paper, I'm going to apply these results to statistics from actual epidemics, to show that these ideas that I've got really are useful and can be are a way forward. But then, of course, remember, we're in the war. This is during the war. Ross is very much involved in other things as well. Tropical diseases are a greater killer in the war in the East than they are from enemy action and so forth. So he's got lots of other things on his mind. But he wants to carry on with this stuff. So he says, well, I need someone to do this statistical work. Remember, he's not being trained as a mathematician or whatever. So he says he applies to the Royal Society for some money for a lady mathematical worker, not surprising, it's during the war. And he gets a grant. So that's all good. And what happens next? Somehow Hudson hears about this. He hears about it from a Miss Thomas. We don't know who Miss Thomas is. But she's at West Ham. Hudson's at West Ham at the moment. I've tried the archives there, but nothing there. But anyway, she's heard about it, and she says, I hear you're looking for someone, and I'd be really glad to kind of know about it. So he writes back, and he says, I'm very glad to be available, especially as your brother, who was unfortunately killed in Wales 10 years ago, was a friend of mine and helped me considerably with some old mathematical work which I've been doing. And he credits Ronald Hudson actually in that 1904 paper. So he knew exactly who she was. And so I think when he got her letter, he thought, you know, I've hit the jackpot here. This is, you know, somebody I know is a mathematician, knew of the family. This is the person I want to work for me. And I think quite interestingly, he says at the end, the work will be published with names appearing jointly. He makes a point of saying that. Now that might not have been obvious from what the job was, that she was theoretically going to be just applying some statistics to some work he'd already been doing. So you might have thought, well, this is quite pedestrian work. Well, I think he knew that if he wanted her, she was already published as a mathematician, that he had to make it as attractive as possible. So she writes back and she says, well, yeah, absolutely, I'm on board with this. Just think it's most interesting and as important as if it had been the war job that she'd supposed it to be. So, so they get going. And in part one, Ross had already listed the titles of what was going to appear in part two, saying that the results are going to be applied to epidemics. But when part three are published, some of these titles have been dropped, and there was some new ones, and the whole application to results to epidemics has been postponed. And we can say, well, what happened? She'd been employed to do this statistical work. Well, I think it's quite clear when you look at the manuscripts, it's Hudson's input into the mathematics. So the mathematics changes, and it becomes much more kind of recognizable. The sort of Cambridge mathematics kind of starts to sort of things look a bit more familiar. They look at various different examples, and they look at things that Ross hadn't indicated in the first paper. They look at different rates of infection, but they also claim that they are going to be looking at records of epidemics to find out whether, you know, how far these theoretical results may be applied to them. But they have to be postponed. But then we get to part three, and this is a really interesting part because more variations in infectivity, more general equations. They consider things like incubation, but the really key thing is they start to think about immunity. And as a result, what happens in part three is the first publication of what is now known as the SIR model, which some of you may recall was even mentioned over the pandemic. SIR being susceptible, infected, removed. And in the when you read about it, it's generally ascribed to two male physicians, Cummack and McKendrick, who do credit Ross and Hudson, but they're not kind of explicitly in this part. And it's almost hidden in the Ross-Hudson paper. The model that they come up with, it gives expressions for the population to final steady state, i.e. when you've got nobody left to do any infecting. And what was really exciting for me was to discover that actually this is Hudson. Hudson is the first person to write down the SIR model. And these are in her manuscripts in the archives of physicians and surgeons in Glasgow. And she doesn't write SIR, she uses AXY. And delightfully, her writing is legible. You know, this is not something that historians of maths always encounter, I can assure you. And so there's kind of 4 pages, and actually they are in the exhibition. You can see these pages. I've got permission from the archives to publish them. I'm working with Julia Gogg at Cambridge, who's one of the leading people in mathematical epidemiology. And she's very excited by this manuscript, and she feels that this is something that would be really important to for students to see. And I gave a talk about this in Zurich not so long ago, and everybody, I mean, they were just sort of stunned to find out about this, and also to find out that actually it was a woman who was behind it. So this has been, you know, really, really exciting. And I think, you know, that actually, probably for poor Hilda, in a way, that she is going to end up being better known for this than maybe her geometry. But there we go. The paper was refereed by Eddington, who was professor of astronomy and head of the observatory in Cambridge. Might think rather a strange choice, but of course, again, we're during the war. And he says, well, you know, it's useful general survey, but the theory is a bit dull and maths elementary, but it's desirable some such treatment decision to be made. And authors in the preface state they're undertaking the application to actual figures. So yeah, we should encourage them to continue. But then, so they do start working on in the correspondence. We see Hudson writing to Ross saying, look, I need to get some statistics from you and so forth. But then in December 1916, she gets offered this post of temporary technical assistant in the aircraft construction department. And she says, look, you know, in view of the circumstances, I really have to take this. This is, you know, I'm reluctant, but, you know, this is the right thing to do. And he's very sorry to lose her, and hopes she'll return at a later, you know, they'll pick it up at a later date. When the war's over, there's kind of communication between them, and she says, look, you know, I'm about to be demobbed. Actually, I don't want to carry on with this work, not because I didn't enjoy it or whatever, but actually for me, the priority is my book on Cremona transformations. I want to work on this, but I have got, you know, somebody in mind who I think would be great to work with you. And so she gets someone called Annie Trout who sends in her application, but Ross rejects it. I mean, he just knows he wants to work with her. I mean, I think if she said she was going to do it, anyway. So what's slightly surprising is the Spanish flu epidemic at this period is not mentioned. I mean, of course, they may well have mentioned it in conversation, but it's not mentioned at all in the correspondence. How are these papers received? Well, Polya in the Jahrbuch, which is the German reviewing journal, says, well, basically, you know, he says, well, it's not necessarily reproduced it. The main focus of the study is, of course, not mathematical. So the maths per se is not so interesting. There's nothing novel in the mathematics. And then Ross in his memoirs says, well, you know, for years I've been trying to do this work on epidemics, and he's had the capable assistance of Hudson, but after a second paper, the war interrupter studies, so little interest was taken in them by the health authorities that I thought it useless to continue them since then. So actually, so what happens is we have these papers get published in the war. The mathematicians don't think they're interesting. The doctors don't think they're interesting. Not a great situation, really. So then what happens? So then we get the papers by Kermack and McKendrick, and these are the papers that people generally say, this is where the SIR model comes up, and they write a series of papers. And I mean, I don't wish to denigrate these papers at all. I mean, that's not the point, but I think the role of Hudson in their papers is something that has really not been given the credit that it should have been. It's interesting that McKendrick was encouraged to study maths by Ross. They were well known to each other and in fact travelled by ship together to Sierra Leone. As a result, Ross gets fired up again, and he says he writes to Hudson and asks her to continue the work. And she says, well, look, I can give you 1 day a week. Of course, her book has been published by this time, so she has got some time. And Ross sends her this paper, and she writes actually a nice review. I think it's a great title. Contagion and Calculus is her review, and she's pretty complimentary about it. She's a little bit snippy about the sort of loose use of mathematics, but she hopes, you know, it'll carry on. And so it's quite active period between them. She goes down and she stays with Ross, but of course by this time Ross has not been well. He's been basically confined to his house by his illness, and I mean he's becoming elderly. And although she keeps, you know, on at him, and she starts working on statistics of epidemics, looking at things like the typhoid epidemic in Maidstone and measles epidemics in Liverpool and so on. Also at this time, we do see that she's doing some electioneering for the Labour Party, but nothing actually new comes out of this work. There's quite a lot of manuscript material in the archives, but actually it's Ross kind of rehashing some of the old stuff, and it's clear he's really slightly kind of lost the plot over it. But the one thing he does manage to do is to get the 3 papers published together as a book with an introduction. Hudson herself says she's not interested in publishing anything unless there's something really new in what they're doing, and which there really wasn't. So that's why it's just these papers get republished as a book. So that's the story of that. So of course now she's also, as we know, she goes off and she does some aeronautics. Surprise, surprise, she's working with Arthur Berry. And so I think he's the person who actually gets the Admiralty to get in touch with her. And she is, her work is very well received. She gets an OBE for it. She also really worked for her, to support her staff. And after the war, she works, as I say, for in industry. There's nothing known about this. I haven't tried, I have to admit, I have not tried to get the archives of Parnell and Company, but she just writes that in a sort of survey that Newnham have sent her. She says that that's what she did during this time. I'd refer you, if you want to know more about this, to an article by Tony Wall, my former student of mine, who wrote about this. But to give you a little bit of a flavour, she contributes to something called the Handbook of Strength Calculations, in which Berry was very much involved. She wrote a paper on incidence wires, and these wires, these red wires here, which are absolutely key in biplanes for keeping the 2 sets of wings, stably separated. So this is quite important work. And then she also works on these laterally loaded struts, which are the struts on the wing to kind of support, to take the load on the wing. After the war, she writes an account. She's invited to write a report, which she writes of an account of her work there. And she says, basically what they were doing was complicated application, the first principle of theoretical mechanics. She needed to have a clearer first grasp of fundamentals of mechanics and calculus. And judgment had to be acquired in choosing methods suitable to date, though often painfully vague and inaccurate. And all along, time had to be saved. Of course, they're in the war. They had to try and get this done as quickly as possible. But there was it was not easy for them, because of the lack of practical knowledge of engineering objects and conventions was a hindrance at first. And she says, well, this was initially, it was overcome by visiting factories and things, but then mainly through the great kindness of the men engineers of the section. And for me, this is a really interesting and nice remark from her, showing how well the women who were working in the department were working together with the men. This report gets edited and printed up with actually a bit more detail of the actual work they were doing in the report. But this remark at the end is not there. And for me, this is really quite important, actually, I think, in about giving us an insight into Hudson. So there's a bit of a mystery surrounding the war work, because I came across this document online, and it's in the Imperial War Museum, and I've been in touch with them. They can't really give me much extra information about it. But we see here Edith Hudson, Winifred Hudson, and Hilda Hudson. Now, Edith Hudson, I thought, oh yeah, the 3 sisters, but actually it's not Enid, it's Ethel. So I don't know whether this is another Hudson or whether there's a typo or whatever. So that has been, but there's no mention by Hilda Hudson of working at Woolwich Arsenal, and nothing that she writes about. But what we do know is that Winifred Hudson did do some work for Littlewood, because Newnham, after the war, they circulated a questionnaire to all the alumni asking them what they did during the war. And Winifred responds saying she did mathematical computations for Miss Littlewood's work in connection with anti-aircraft gunnery. So we know that she did, but there's a kind of gap in Winifred's mathematical career, if you like, because we know nothing about her mathematically from doing part 2 of the Tripos to this point here. And as I say, I don't know whether this really is Edith or Ethel, and I'm going to see if I can try and find out more about that. She has, apart from these, she has a couple of publications late in her, well, it's not really her career because this is after she's given up sort of paid employment. She writes an article called Maths in Eternity, and this is where we really see her, the significance and importance of her faith for her in mathematics. That was in 1925. But this article, the next one, is this Mathematics in Ordinary Discord. And I mean, I just love this opening. I suppose we have all at one time or another suffered from the misguided hostess who introduces one as a mathematician. How many times have we all said things like that? Anyway, it kind of goes on, but this I think is also quite interesting, where she's talking about no sphere in existence with lying or swank is so unattractive, unprofitable, you're found out directly, and so forth. But then another thing from which we're entirely sheltered is avarice, because there is no money in mathematics. And therefore, that particular root of evil does not come into our universe of discourse. And of course, it brings to mind, Hardy saying that, all the maths that he did, he was really happy that none of it had been useful for anything. And of course, we all know his number theory is so fundamental now for, cybersecurity and so forth. But this is quite a delightful article. I kind of recommend it really. And I think, again, it gives us an insight into her character. Right, I'm now going to make a bold claim about her. I'm going to say that I think she is the youngest person to have had a result communicated to the London Mathematical Society. Because in Nature, it was reported the following proof of Euclid 2, 9, and 10, believed to be new, due to Miss Hilda Hudson, was communicated to the London Mathematical Society at their last meeting. And this was in December 1891. This is a result about squares on different areas of squares on lines and so forth. And it's quite a kind of like neat little proof that she does, this is in the article. She becomes, she's elected a member in 1906, publishes 8 papers in the journals, including one in the first volume of the Journal of the LMS. The other ones have been in the proceedings. So the first volume, which came out in 1926, she is one of the people who publishes it. She's the first female member of LMS Council. She attends the 60th birthday celebration in 1925 with Winifred. That's reported. So that, to me, again, sort of hints that Winifred is still interested in mathematics, because otherwise, why would you want to go to a birthday dinner with mathematicians if you hadn't still got an interest? So, so I think, so that's a nice little sort of tidbit, really. So that, is really Hilda Hudson's career and her mathematics and things. And so this, raises the question. She was a very expert mathematician. This is Ross's description, and he actually is quite interesting. When you see the correspondence, he keeps kind of going up and up. In his estimation, she goes up and up. She's kind of a capable assistant, and then she kind of reaches, she becomes a very expert mathematician by the end. But she has a substantial reputation as a geometer. This is her lecture at the ICM. Hardy, when she's wanting to publish her book, Hardy applies to the Royal Society for funds to help publish it. So he is obviously a fan. She's very versatile. I mean, with her geometry, mathematical epidemiology, aeronautics, even her interest in astronomy, and so forth, and being able to write kind of more broadly about mathematics. And she's collaborative. You can see the work with Ross, work in her wartime work on the LMS Council. She wrote an article together with Wren. So it kind of raises the question as to why somebody who really is involved in lots of areas of mathematics as a woman at a time when there weren't many women mathematicians, why she has not kind of risen to the surface more than she has. And I've got a few suggestions for this. I think her book, Cremona Transformations, it is absolutely not an easy read. It's still referenced. If you do a kind of search on MathSciNet, you'll get some references to it, even relatively recent. Not a lot, but they're still there because it is an absolute mine of information. But it's not a fashionable subject now. the exact nature of her contribution to the joint papers with Ross are not known until now. Her work in aeronautics, although vital and important, was a sort of relatively small part in a very big enterprise. And of course, she had no academic position after World War I. And compare that, for example, with Mary Cartwright. I know she's a different sort of caliber of mathematician, but she, as well as becoming a fellow of the Royal Society, I mean, she's mistress of Girton. So she has a presence, a very public presence in the mathematical world. Whereas I think Hudson, I mean, she's clearly active in the LMS, is the fact that Hardy, wants to help her with the publication. But otherwise she's kind of invisible, I think. So I think, that's really why I think that she's not had the recognition that I think she deserves as a mathematician who was clearly talented, clearly very versatile. But she wasn't somebody who was, she didn't have students, for instance, either. So I think that, she's just not been in the public eye, really. And I just want to conclude by thanking the archivists who really helped me with this: Claire Franklin at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Claire Harrison at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow, Frida Midgley at Newnham, and Florence Moon at the Imperial War Museum. I mean, this kind of research that I do and Bridget does and historians of maths do, I mean, we would not be able to do it without archivists. And they're just such an important part of what we do. So I think it's really important that we give them due credit and are extremely grateful to them. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. So we have time for some questions, and I'm going to ask June if you could paraphrase the question as part of the answer. So, any questions?
Oh, you suggested that the Spanish flu was omitted from the development of epidemiology at the time. Surely somebody must have.
So the question is, I suggested that it was Spanish flu was omitted from mathematical epidemiology at the time. So basically what I was saying was it doesn't come up at all in the correspondence or anything between Ross and Hudson, which you might have expected it to do. And you might have thought that because of it, when Hudson said, look, I'm sorry, I can't carry on with this work because I need to get on with my Cremona transformations, because of the Spanish flu, you might have thought he would have thought, well, actually, now is the right moment to really, maybe the doctors will sit up and listen. But that doesn't come up, and he doesn't mention it in his memoirs. And so I'm not saying that other people aren't obviously trying to do that, but in the context of this particular story, I haven't looked into that.
So we have a question from Zoom asking what she did for the rest of her life after about 1930.
Yeah. So she worked as this honorary secretary for this. Right back to get the right back to the beginning, where she basically, I think she's just doing work for this. What is it called? Sorry about this. Take a little time. Oops, there we go. So she's the Hon Finax secretary of the Student Christian Movement. So Newnham College sent out a questionnaire to its alumni, and she fills in, and this is basically what she says she's doing at this time. And I think she's probably involved in other charitable work, I would imagine. She writes, there's a couple of other papers, the one in 1930 and the paper for the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1929. But then, her interest in mathematics there's no evidence. But the other thing I do know that she was very severely crippled with arthritis in the last few years of her life as well. So that would have presumably had some effect.
Thank you.
So it seems that this work with Ross and Hudson was sort of forgotten or fell over time didn't really get completed in the way you would have expected and got forgotten over time. But today there is a very abundant and successful discipline of mathematical biology, right? Can you trace some impact or some history or some fertilization, etc.?
Yeah. So I mean, as I say, Cumberland McKendrick do mention, and we see one or two references, sort of subsequently. Sometimes they are just to Ross. Her name is not on. I mean, sometimes people have said to me, look, why is it Ross and Hudson when, alphabetically it should be Hudson Ross. I mean, I have zero problem with that because, it was his idea. It was his paper, the first paper. So I think, it was entirely right, fair enough. But so I think, you can kind of trace back this, this SIR model to them. But as I say, it's normally traced back to Kermack and McKendrick, and then that they write, like, I think it's a series of 4 papers or something, and so that's where things, and there are people who take interest in what they're doing, people like Brownlee and various people who make comments, and Lotka, and there are 1 or 2 comments, but I think the wartime element of it has something to do with it. I also think Ross has something to do with it, because he is a difficult person, and he has polemics. And I think, the fact that he couldn't get the doctors interested in mathematics probably is, he's probably not the best person to, to make overtures in that direction. That's a personal opinion, I have to say. But what is really nice is when you read the correspondence, they have quite formal, it's dear Sir Ronald and dear Miss Hudson and whatever, but it's quite jokey, the correspondence in the, and she's clearly got the measure of him. And I mean, there's one letter where he writes and he wants her to come and visit him in, in the second session in the 1920s. And he says, well, why haven't you come to visit me? He said, there's only one reason I can think of, and that's because you've become too stout. That's the only reason I can think of. And I mean, and it's not meant offensively, you can see it sort of, and she responds and she goes and stays with him, and, but I think, I think he wasn't somebody that other people really, gravitated towards. And also from the point of view of him in his career, if it had taken off in 1916, that would have been a good moment for him. But I think by the time, he comes back to it, it's too late. His faculties are failing to a certain extent, I think.
Well, I've also not, I mean, I understand how he came to the word pathometry.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Yeah. It doesn't get taken up. Yeah.
There's a question there.
Yes, so that's a simple question. What was she actually living on?
Right. So my hunch about that is I don't have the evidence. I probably could go and look up wills and things. But her father dies, and I think, he must have been kind of reasonably well off. Of course, the brother has died. The other 2 sisters don't marry. So I think that he probably had left enough. And I don't know also about the mother's circumstance, whether she had inherited any money, that they could live off, that they had the house and they could live off basically what the father had left them. Because there's never any, when there's a discussion with money with Ross, she doesn't sort of say, well, I can only afford to do it if you give me, twice as much, otherwise I'll have to go and work somewhere else or anything. I mean, that's never an issue. She's quite happy with whatever she offers. So I think, yeah.
So I mean, she has worked.
Yeah.
Salary worked over about 15 years.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I mean, maybe she saved up but I don't think she would have been earning a huge amount. But so I suspect there must have been a sufficient family money. Yeah.
I think it's probably with the last question, but we'll give it to Bridget.
The position at the West Ham Technical Institute, was that a permanent position that she just left because of the war?
Yes, yes. So
do you know why she didn't go back?
Well, I think, presumably, maybe because she wasn't such a good teacher, but also I think maybe having got involved in the aeronautical work, so they would have presumably replaced her at some point. I mean, there would have been women. There's a good question. I mean, it'd be interesting to see who does have that position after she leaves, but I think that she does this work interesting. I mean, I just imagine she's got quite interested in doing this aeronautical work, and she's clearly done it very well. And maybe the pay for that would have been better. Actually, that's playing to your question. Yeah.
It must have been very unusual at that time to have like for a woman to have a permanent position, because it's still in Cambridge at that time. Most women's colleges would just hire you for like for a couple of years or a year at a time on a renewed
Yeah,
contract.
I mean, so this, I think this position is a bit, it's a bit more like probably a further education college. So it's not, you know, it's not university, it's not a school, which is what most women, if they were going to go on teaching math, would have been doing, because there weren't positions in, you know, because there weren't that many places where women could study at university level. Of course, that's why Charlotte Scott is so exceptional, because, you know, she goes off to Bryn Mawr and she can make a career there as professor of maths and have PhD students and everything else. But I think, you know, for Hudson, I mean, I don't think she was particularly ambitious, actually. I think, you know, she cared about maths, she cared about doing her maths, and she wanted to write her book, and she wanted to do the, you know, whatever maths she was invited to do, she would do it, you know. So I think, I mean, it would be interesting to look at other comparable colleges, but it is noticeable that she is the only woman in the science department. There isn't anybody else on the kind of next page from this chemistry and engineering and so on. And the fact she was selected out of 51 candidates. So it would be quite, I mean, I don't have a list of the, you know, other 50, but I'm presuming that quite a lot of them would have been men.
If it's a list of 51 women, I definitely want that list. Thank you.
Okay, so I think
Here, a really fine question. It might be got into a mathematical thing. If you could kind of go back to the slide where it was about Cremona transformations. Yes, the papers that she wrote. I think I've seen the photos of the papers. Maybe before. I think you put the pictures of the papers. If you could remember.
Well, I put that one. That's the only one I put up. There are, maybe you saw them in that. They're in the exhibition.
Yes. So my question is, did she write the paper about just a like transformation within the integer field, or is it more like up to how many grains?
She's going up to it's the book is up to between 2 and 3 dimensions.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah.
So precisely, there's a trivial transformation, more like trivial, rather than non-trivial.
I'm sorry, I don't really understand what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, like as in, I was curious about that paper. I was reading it, and then I've got sort of, you know, questions about.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk about it afterwards. Okay.
so. I think we should probably draw things to a close down. Just you said there'll be more opportunity for questions for the reception. So do please join me in thanking Julie and Ingrid.